We moved from November into the month of December. And there's a question that always starts around this time of year that you're probably going to get asked several times between now and the 25th. And the question is, what do you want for Christmas? So what do you want for Christmas, really? I mean, have you even thought about it? And by the way, if you're new here, my name's Jason, one of the pastors here on staff at Community Christian, and I'll tell you what my experience has been to that question. My experience is that the older I get, the more the answer to that question changes. From a specific gift that I might want for Christmas to really specific hopes or expectations that I just have for the Christmas season. See, when I was a kid, well, the answer to that question was different. What I wanted for Christmas when I was a kid was something like I wanted a new bike, or I wanted a Nintendo, or, and I know this is going to date me, but I wanted an Atari 2600. Y'all are going to have to Google that. But as I've gotten older, what that question brings to my mind is different. When I get older, and you may be experiencing this too, or you have experienced this, what I want looks more like a picture in my mind. Looks more like an expectation. And what does a picture look like? Well, can we just be honest? For a lot of us, it looks like that Publix commercial that just came out, right? They're always coming out with new ones, and I saw the latest one, and it got me again this year, right? But can we all just admit that for a second? In many of our grown-up Christmas expectations, our grown-up Christmas wish list, so to speak, every event in our minds goes according to plan. They are fun, they are memorable, they are meaningful. And somehow, some way, in our minds, we remember to get pictures of all of it. We check off every list on our to-do list ahead of time. The presents got purchased. They all got wrapped, and they were put under the tree early. The family got all together, and we got together, and we ate this wonderful meal, and nobody fought about anything. And we had plenty of time to just sit and rest and sip on some cocoa or some eggnog with our loved ones under the light of the Christmas tree by the warmth of that fire. That's what you want for Christmas. And it's okay. You can just admit that. What we really want at this time of year is we want a season of time, a period of time in our year where everything goes just easy and everything is simple and it's happy and it's cozy and everybody's sweet and everybody's cheerful and everybody gets along and I'm stress-free and I feel all warm and fuzzy and content on the inside just like those Christmas pajamas I love. Now, I've got some good news, but I've also got some bad news. The good news is that kind of Christmas definitely does exist. That's the good news. The bad news is the only place it exists is inside of your head, inside of your imagination, especially if you've got some kids running around the house, right? I mean, especially in that time, because, see, we feel this way, and yet somehow all of us go into the holidays and we have these high expectations, but nearly every year, can we just be honest? The pursuit of those expectations winds up leaving us with stress, and we're all busy, and there's conflict around us. We rush through every moment and try to get to the next moment. We go from one event to the next event, and we drag 2 or 3 other people around with us who clearly aren't happy to be there. And when those other people don't live up to our expectations, then we start carrying frustration and bitterness and disappointment towards them. And no matter how much planning you put into it, nothing ever goes according to plan. And when we're honest about it, we would say, you know, the holidays, they just always turn out to be, well, just a little bit messy. Or maybe it's different for you. Maybe this year is different for you. Maybe this year you don't have high expectations for your holidays because, well, you're going to have to see some people who bring up a lot of unwanted emotions for you, and there's so much tension at those family gatherings, and there's always so much unspoken going around that table that leaves you screaming on the inside. So you just are dropping the expectations. Because these moments, they're supposed to be loving and joy-filled, and you're just like, I know how messy this is going to be, so I don't even want to go there and expect anything better. Or maybe it's different for you because this holiday season you already know is not going to be perfect because you already know it's going to be difficult for you. It's a difficult season because this Christmas, it's the first Christmas without someone you love. It's the first Christmas you're divorced, or it's the first Christmas where your kids are not all going to be in the house with you. For you, maybe this whole year has just been difficult, and it's one of those situations, and I hear people say this every year, I'm just ready to get through the season because I want to hit restart on the new year. I'm hoping next year is going to be better than this one. So regardless of what might be keeping your holiday from being like that Hallmark movie Publix commercial picture in your mind, the truth is your holiday season most likely is going to be messy. It will be for all of us in one way or another. But believe it or not, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. So for the next few weeks, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Christmas story that's found in the Bible. We're going to look at the very first Christmas for these next few weeks. And what we're going to see, just preview, is going to be really messy. Because the story of Christmas, that first Christmas, is a messy story. But it's beautiful, all at the same time. And it's not beautiful necessarily because of what is happening around the story, because a lot of things are going on that aren't very beautiful. But what makes the Christmas story so beautiful is because of who is in the center. Jesus Christ, the Son of God, meeting us in the middle of the mess. Because isn't it true that often the best Christmas memories that we wind up having are not the ones where everything went according to plan? Not the moments that we thought they were going to be. They wound up being the moments that we weren't planning. If you think about it, haven't some of your most meaningful times in your life, you look back on and you think, well, that was also the messy times. It was also the difficult ones. And even if your mess is so painful, you don't even want to put a positive spin on it. I want you to think about that for just a moment. And what might happen if you allowed God to meet you in the middle of your messy Christmas? Is it possible he could turn the messiness and the unmet expectations into something beautiful in the middle of your mess? It's a great thought. But I'll tell you what, here's the key. As long as we're pretending, as long as we're trying to dress up our mess, most likely we won't see all that God's trying to do. And when we stop trying to tidy up our lives and instead choose to embrace the mess of our reality, that's when we actually meet God with us in the midst of the mess. So here's what we're going to do today as we kick off this Christmas series. I want to talk to you about what I have come to see, and what many of you would agree, has become the messiest part about Christmas. Today, we're going to talk about family. And see, you knew that, right? When I said that word, you're like, oh yeah, that's the messy part, right? Because nothing spells messy around the holidays like families sometimes. All the conflict that winds up being there sometimes, the tension, the past hurts, the unforgiveness, these unresolved problems and relationships that we wind up having in our families. And often what we wind up doing when we go to these family gatherings that happen around this time of the year is we just want to try and sweep everything under the rug. We just don't even want to talk about it. It's just like, can everybody just stay calm? Can everybody just be quiet? Can we not talk about politics or not talk about religion or not talk about the past? Just not talk about any of it and just let's just strive for peace. But what winds up happening is we strive for a peace, but it's really a false peace because what we're doing is covering up our problems and we're ignoring them. Or we just spend the holidays avoiding all the messy people. I'm just checking out. I'm not going to be around those people. But what if Jesus in the story of Christmas can offer us a better way? That's what I want to look at today. Now, if you've ever decided that you were going to sit down and read the story of Jesus' life that we find in the pages of Scripture, in those 4 biographies that we have written by eyewitnesses and their accounts of the life of Jesus, if you've ever tried to start to read those, and maybe you approach them and you said, well, I'll just start at the beginning. Isn't that the best place to start? You may have found that part, well, kind of difficult. Because the very first book that we have in our New Testament in the Bible that gives us the life of Jesus is the book called Matthew. And Matthew starts out his account in the Christmas story, can I say this in church? In the most boring possible way you can do it. That's true, at least from our perspective. If you haven't read it, Matthew starts out his account of Jesus' life by listing out 42 generations in the family tree of Jesus. You know those parts in the Bible that you've tried to read that you got so bored with because it's so-and-so was the father of so-and-so, and so-and-so was the father of this guy, and this guy was the father of this guy, and it just goes on and on and on. Matthew puts in 42 generations to start the book off. It's like, doesn't it make you kind of wonder what Matthew was thinking? It's like, come on, Matthew. I mean, if you're going to write the story of what you say is the most significant person who ever lived, I think you would want to start with something a little catchy, something a little interesting, something that might grab the attention. But instead, Matthew starts with basically a cure for insomnia. And all kidding aside, there is a reason for this. And that's what we're going to look at today.
Genealogies were very popular in ancient Israel, probably because no one had TikTok yet. I mean, no one's watching TV or movies at night, so they would sit around fires and tell stories. And one of their favorite ways of storytelling was to list the names of their ancestors and tell the great stories of all the things they did. So all these names that we can hardly pronounce, they knew all of them. And when they heard the names, they remembered the stories. And it gave them a sense of identity and dignity. I'm not just a nobody, I have a history. Ask me who I am and I'll tell you about my people. Scholars tell us that to this day in the Middle East, there are tribal nomads who can recite the names of their ancestors going back centuries. They can literally go on for hours listing names. In Jesus' day, they didn't have written records like we do. So to prove things like legal status and property rights, you used your genealogy. And for generations, Israel had been waiting for the Messiah, the Anointed One. And if there was one thing the Jewish people knew, it was which family line the Messiah would come from. So really, it's not that surprising that Matthew would start the story of Jesus with a record of his family that includes names like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were the famous people in the family line of the Messiah. Matthew is providing evidence of Jesus' identity as the Messiah. But what is surprising is that there's some messiness that Matthew slips into the family tree. Matthew includes Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. He throws in the name of a woman where it technically does not belong. No ancient genealogy included mothers, but even more so, not mothers with Tamar's kind of story. Now, my guess is you don't know this story, but everyone in Jesus' day did. Here's how it went. Judah, one of the sons of Jacob, decides to go find a wife for his oldest son. He goes to a foreign nation, to the Canaanites, and finds this woman named Tamar, and she marries Judah's son. His name was Now I know what all of you ladies are thinking. Who wouldn't want to marry a guy named But this was a really wicked person, and he winds up getting put to death, leaving Tamar with no husband. Now, according to law and custom, Judah is obligated to make sure his daughter-in-law is taken care of, especially since he took her away from her people. But he doesn't. He breaks his covenant. And being a woman, she has no legal rights. She can't do anything about it. Judah has done a horrible thing to Tamar. So she takes matters into her own hands. She disguises herself as a prostitute and waits by the side of the road where she knows Judah, her father-in-law, will be passing by. It's dark and she has a veil on, so he doesn't recognize her. He hires her, sleeps with her, and doesn't pay her. So instead, he gives his staff and seal as a pledge that one day he will return and pay his debt. Then he goes home. Now, I know not all of our families are Publix quality, but this is another level, right? It gets worse. A few months go by, and Judah finds out his widowed daughter-in-law, Tamar, is pregnant out of wedlock. And he is furious. It's embarrassing to his family. So he has her brought before him and intends to burn her alive. So they bring out Tamar, and she has in her hand Judah's staff and seal. She holds them up and says, "Okay, burn me if you want, but first, you need to know I'm pregnant by the man who owns this staff and seal. Does anyone know who that is?" Judah realizes what he's done. He stops the execution and repents of his sin. Now, in case you're worried, I don't think this is the Bible story for our children this week, because no one teaches this Bible story to kids. I mean, no matter how dysfunctional your family is, you ain't got nothing on these guys. So Tamar gives birth to twins, 2 boys. And as they're born, one of them reaches his hand out of her body first, and the midwife ties a scarlet cord around his wrist, because it was important to know which one was the firstborn. There was a promise, a blessing being passed down from Abraham to Isaac, to Jacob to Judah. One day, the Messiah would come through this family line. The scarlet cord is a reminder, and it runs through this story. And Matthew puts that detail in Jesus' story. The story is a disaster. It's embarrassing. It's a mess. But Matthew doesn't blink. He includes Tamar and Judah and their whole messy story in the most important genealogy in history. Because there's something we need to see about this Messiah from this messy family.
And it just keeps getting messier. Matthew goes on, in fact. One of the generations that he highlights, he says, Jesus' family came from a man named Salmon, who was the father of Boaz, and his mother was Rahab. Now, Rahab, again, including another woman where most of these genealogies, no women were ever included. She's also a Gentile, which means she's not a part of their family line. She's not an Israelite. And Rahab, you need to know, doesn't just dress up like a prostitute like Tamar did. She actually was one. This is actually literally what she did to make a living. By the way, you ever noticed how in the Bible you find quite a number of stories about prostitutes? Well, the reason for that is because in the ancient world, if a woman was not married and she was not being cared for by her immediate family, she basically had 3 choices in life. She could starve to death, she could beg, or become a prostitute. Because we know this. No woman ever grows up saying, well, that's what I want to be when I grow up. It happens. It's something that happens to them. It's not a choice that they make. They are victims of systems and circumstances that have been set against them. And so Rahab, her story is she lives in this city. It's a city called Jericho, and her house is literally a part of the city wall. It's right on the border. Joshua at the time was the leader of the Israelite nation, and he sends spies into Jericho to go and check things out. Jericho is the first city that the nation of Israel is going to come and overtake in the promised land, the place that God was leading them to after Moses led them out of slavery in Egypt. And for some reason, when these spies come into the land and they're checking things out before the battle begins, Rahab's heart is open to God, and she's open to the Israelites, and she actually risks her life to protect these men, these spies. So as a reward to her, the spies tell her, they say, look, you just need to know we're coming back, and we're going to take this whole city. It's going to all be overtaken. But as a reward to you for being so kind to us, if you will gather your people, the people you love, into your house here on the city wall, and if you tie a scarlet cord in the window, there's that theme again, tie a scarlet cord in the window, your house will be spared and all who are in it. Since you were kind to us, when we see that scarlet cord, you'll be saved. The story's in Joshua chapter 2 if you ever want to read it. But again, for those who read this family tree of Jesus for the very first time, here's what they're hearing, here's what they're seeing. Oh, he's included a woman in the story, a Gentile woman, and not only that, a prostitute. How messy, how scandalous. Why would you include that? But then, the very next line, Matthew ups the ante again. He talks about Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Now, some of you may know the story of Ruth. It's kind of a little well-known story in the Bible. It starts with a woman. Her name is Naomi. She and her husband live in Bethlehem, but there comes this famine in the land. And so to get into a better economic situation, they take their 2 sons and they go to another country, a country called Moab. Now, both of her sons wind up getting married there. They find women in Moab and they marry them, but then for whatever reason, we don't know how it happened, but both sons and her husband die. So Naomi is left with no family. She's devastated. And she realizes the best chance she has for survival is to go back home to Israel. But she's got these 2 daughters-in-law here in Moab, And she says to them, look, I know this is not your people. There's no reason you should follow me back to Israel, but this is what I have to do. You need to stay here in your home country of Moab, live your lives, find a husband from among your own nation, and remarry so that you can live a better life. But Ruth, who is one of these wives, she loves her mother-in-law, and she will not leave her. She just loves her so much. I know, unbelievable story. And Ruth winds up saying these famous words to Naomi, her mother-in-law. You've probably heard them quoted at weddings. She says, no, wherever you go, I'll go. Wherever you stay, I'll stay. Your people are going to be my people, and your God will be my God. What a great story, right? But there's something else you need to know about this story. Something you need to know about Ruth. Ruth wasn't just a Gentile. She was also a Moabite. That means probably nothing to most of us, but according to the book of Genesis, chapter 19, the Moabites were the product of an incestuous relationship between a man named Lot and one of his daughters. I know, horrible story. And so because of this, the Moabites were considered by the Israelites to be so unclean, so untouchable, and so bad that they created a law, and the law said this: no Ammonite or Moabite or any other of their descendants may enter into the assembly of the Lord, not even down to the 10th generation. So you could be 10 generations removed from having Moabite blood in your family line, and they still wouldn't accept you. You were still outcast. Ruth is a Moabite, and Matthew put her in the story. That means that the line leading to the Messiah has Moabite blood. Scandalous. Matthew's not even done yet. He goes on, he talks about David, the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. Another little parenthetical phrase. Now I want you to think about this. Matthew mentions King David. Most of us know about King David. King David was one of the great kings of the nation of Israel. Matthew could have highlighted any detail about the life of David that he wanted to bring out glory and honor into the family line of Jesus. He could have talked about David, who wrote most of the Psalms in your Bible. He could have talked about David, who killed the giant Goliath. But he leaves out all that, and instead, he describes David this way. When he says whose mother was Uriah's wife, here's the story, because remember, they passed these stories down. Here's the story that everyone would have recalled when they read that phrase. David, who took his good friend's wife, forced her to have sex with him, got her pregnant, murdered her husband, and covered it up so he could marry her. That's what they would have heard. For those of you who aren't familiar with it, this is the story of David and Uriah's wife, who had a name. Her name was Bathsheba. So make no mistake about this. What Matthew does here is intentional. He's doing this on purpose. He starts out the story of Jesus with a genealogy, which is a great way to start in their culture. It's a great idea. But he keeps throwing in names where they do not belong in their culture. He keeps throwing in women, outsiders, scandal. Matthew, what are you thinking? Don't you realize what you're doing? Don't you understand what a genealogy is supposed to do? Remember what you heard in the video? Ask me who I am. I will tell you my people. I will tell you my story. He's laying this out for Jesus. So why would you reflect all back on this, on the identity of the Son of God with all of this messiness and all of this scandal? See, here's what I think Matthew is intending to communicate. I think Matthew, in very subtle ways, is saying to his readers all throughout the generations, hey, here's the Christmas story, but you just need to know this is probably not going to go like you expect it to go. In fact, get ready. Things are about to get messy. Because the people that Jesus is about to come and identify with in his life, the people Jesus will come and love and let into his kingdom, are not going to look like the people you expect them to look like. Things are going to get a little scandalous. It's not always going to be real respectable. Because now, when Jesus comes, anybody who wants to get in is getting in. Because Jesus wants everybody in. It's almost like God intended for people to read this genealogy, and as they read, they would say to themselves, oh, so this Jesus is the kind of person who's not ashamed of sinners. In fact, he even puts them in his family tree. And what we see here from the very beginning of the Christmas story is that Jesus does not just come for messy people with messy families. Jesus came from messy people with a messy family. So I get that some of you may be here today because it's Christmas. And coming to church is just sometimes what you do around the Christmas time. But honestly, if you and I had a conversation and you could be so bold to tell me your story and we would just sort of talk it through, generally you would tell me, well, I mostly just stay away from church because I just be honest with you, from the outside looking in, it just seems like church is for good people who have their stuff all figured out. Or, as I've been noticing lately in our culture, it's really for people who don't have their stuff all figured out, but they like pretending as if they do. Church is for the people who like to put on masks. They like to come to this gathering every Sunday and make themselves look better in front of other people and then maybe even feel better about themselves. And you're thinking that this whole church and this whole Jesus thing, it ain't me. Or maybe others of you, your story is that when you look at the community of God or you look at Jesus and you look at the church, you would say, I've just messed up too much. My sin's too dark. And they say God loves everybody, but I don't know. God couldn't possibly love or let alone be proud of someone who's done the things that I have done. And to all of you, I think what Jesus would say today is this. Are you kidding me? Look at my family. Look at who I came from. You have no idea what I can do. You have no idea who you're dealing with if you just open yourself up to me. Did you know that when Jesus was here, Jesus, in his ministry, was so closely associated with the wrong kinds of people that he gained a reputation, and they accused him of being a glutton and a drunkard. He was just a party guy. He just hung out with all the bad places and with all the bad people. In fact, they put a phrase on him. They used to call him Jesus, the friend of sinners. Now today, we use that as a compliment. We write it in our songs, and we make it out to be this great thing. Then it was not. It was a slur. It was a criticism. It was an accusation. But in these first few lines of the story, Matthew is starting to clue us in on something. This Messiah, he's going to get in a lot of trouble over his associations. See, Matthew is the one who also tells us that when the soldiers mocked Jesus at the end of his life, when they put a robe on his body, which, by the way, had turned scarlet from his blood, when they put a crown of thorns on his head and they put spikes through his hands and his feet and a sword through his side, on the cross, we see another scarlet thread running all the way through the story. It came through the Old Testament, all the way through all these old stories about all these old sinners and these people who are outcast, and we see it finally, ultimately, in the one who took on all of our sin. That scarlet thread is a sign of your salvation, all the way to that bloodstained cross. See, that's why around here, the coming of Jesus for us, we call it good news. And so when Matthew tells us about this genealogy of Jesus, he's making a statement about the kind of people that Jesus had come for by explaining the kind of people Jesus came from. And even though Jesus coming for sinners is good news for those of us who feel like we've done too much and how could God love me, it's also good news for those relationships where we feel like, well, there's just been too much and it'll never be fixed again and it'll never be made whole. Because I'm telling you, if Jesus can forgive you and me, if Jesus can reconcile you back to God and me back to God, he can lead us to forgive the people who've wronged us. He has the power to bring reconciliation and wholeness to every messy relationship in our lives. Now, is it going to happen with every single relationship? No, probably not. Is it going to be easy? No, probably not. Is it going to get messy? Oh, yeah, it will. But maybe this Christmas, in order for you to get what you really want, Instead of avoiding the mess, maybe God is saying to you, I'll be right in the middle of it with you. Because, guys, that's where God's always been. It's what Jesus got born into. And so now he's sending his people, you and me, into the mess of this world, maybe the mess of your family, to bring the kingdom in, wherever you are. Because he'll be there with you in the middle of it. Because see, the love and the grace and the patience that God has shown you, he calls you and me to show to the people in our world. And I know what you're thinking. You're like, but you ain't heard my story. You ain't heard about my family. You don't know how bad it is. You don't know the mess. You don't know the hurt. You don't know the chaos that's there. If you knew my story, you wouldn't say all of that. But I'll just tell you, it's not about what I think. And I'm sure you have a story. And I probably couldn't even imagine. But it's not about what I think, and it's really not even about what you think. It's about the God who didn't just come for messy people, he came from them. So today we're going to spend a few moments just sitting with that and really talking to God about what it is he might be leading all of us to do. So Ed's going to come and lead us in prayer.